Today we're taking a look at a 2-issue story from Chris Claremont's Uncanny X-Men that packs a surprisingly powerful punch, and that is, of course, Days of Future Past. A story that is masterfully imbued with an overwhelming sense of hopelessness and desperation, but also cleverly illustrates the importance of the X-Men and the dream that they fight for. Now, while the trope of a terrible future that our cast of characters needs to prevent from happening is fairly common in science fiction, this is surely one of the most iconic comic book iterations. Before I set the scene, let's remember that these issues came out in 1981. I mention that for 2 reasons. The first is that the dystopian future our heroes find themselves trying to avoid is set in the year 2013, which is nearly a decade behind us in real time. The second reason being that I think it's valuable to have some historical context for the time, also accounting for the author's formative years, especially considering the inherently political nature of this story. The civil rights movement, in fact, would have been a larger part of those years for Chris Claremont, considering that he'd moved to the USA in 1953. For some perspective, schools were forced to desegregate only 1 year later due to the Supreme Court case, Brown v. the Board of Education, and only a year after that, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on an Alabama bus and was arrested for that very reason. My point is, I believe the racial discrimination, irrational hatred, and violence that was reflected in the political climate of Claremont's upbringing is relevant when discussing this story, as these 2 issues can be seen to act as a very important reminder of the horrors and atrocities that may live again if we forget about the past and let similar ideologies pave a path for the future. With all that said, we can begin our examination of X-Men Days of Future Past, which opens in New York City itself, except this isn't in the 616 universe that we're used to, but is instead a dystopian future where Sentinels, giant mutant hunting machines, have taken control and the mutant population is on the verge of extinction. Even more devastating than all that, the remaining mutants are forced to wear an M to indicate their status as a mutant and have also been either killed or put into concentration camps, a clear allusion to the atrocities of World War II. But an important factor in this story is that mankind's bigotry hasn't just brought destruction upon mutantkind, but it's ruined life for everyone. Humans also wear a marking, an H to indicate their status, and some humans wear an A to indicate that they possess potential mutant genes and are therefore forbidden to procreate. If you think that sounds a lot like eugenics, then you're correct. But those categories of class identification aren't the only way that society is ruined now. The future that we're introduced to in this story is actually a result of the Sentinels taking over and a nuclear holocaust. And that was all a domino effect of one defining moment, which we'll get to later, but first we need to talk about our central protagonist of this story, and that is Kitty Pryde, who is no stranger to being a point of view character, being a younger X-Men introduced on the team, and someone a lot of ourselves can sort of see ourselves in. And as she and her journey learns more about the X-Men, so do we, the reader, through her. It's her youthful, wide-eyed innocence and clever and charming nature that makes her such a great character for this purpose. The difference in this story, however, is that we're introduced to an older and wiser Kitty who has lived out this terrible future. So it's a semi-familiar Kitty who is our viewpoint character, but whereas we usually witness the horrors of the world with her and learn how awful they are through that experience, in this instance, Kitty has already lived a life full of those horrors, and that pain and fear is less temporary and in the moment and more baked into this version of the character, which is an effective way to show us the scope of the story and emphasize the stakes. But we learn that in the face of hopelessness, Kitty is still fighting the good fight, and there is a sect of mutants who are still alive and are trying to make sure that their reality doesn't come to fruition. And that group consists of Wolverine, Storm, and Colossus, who is now married to Kitty. They're all older versions of themselves, of course. As for the rest of the X-Men we knew and many of the other Marvel heroes, they're all dead in this future. It's also worth noting the daughter of Jean Grey and Cyclops, Rachel Summers, makes her appearance here as she is from this future, and we also get an older Franklin Richards, who is the son of Reed Richards and Sue Storm.
And how could I possibly forget, we get an old man Magneto as well, who in this dark future has taken on a kind of Professor Xavier role to the remaining mutants. It's pretty clear Claremont wanted to make this parallel too. He even went so far as to put this Magneto in a wheelchair, so there's additionally a visual parallel element to it. But the big questions the reader would have at this point in the comic, I think, is how does this terrible future take place, And is there a way to stop it? That second question is a really interesting one too, and we'll circle back to it specifically, but for now, we can acknowledge that this team of mutants in the future, at the very least, it might be a Hail Mary play, but they think they can stop their timeline from ever happening, from ever turning into this destructive, apocalyptic future that it is. So here's basically what their plan is. So they've all got these power inhibiting collars on, and they use a device to circumvent that, and then Rachel, in an awesome display of power she doesn't normally use, uses her powers to send Kitty Pryde's mind back in time to the body of her younger self, which brings us to our X-Men in their present, as Kitty awakens, and she is not the Kitty we once knew, but she is this future Kitty, who's familiar but also very different based on her life experiences. I also want to mention that there's a trope in here with Kitty Pryde and Colossus that is used in a few other stories, and I always love it. And essentially what that is making a sacrifice, sacrificing your love for the greater good. So Kitty Pryde, knowing that she's going back in time to try and change her current future, she knows that that also puts at risk her whole life with Colossus, their love and everything, because, ideally, if the plan works out, the future wouldn't turn out the way it is, so that relationship wouldn't actually be exactly how it was. It may exist in some other form or not, but there's a gamble there, and I think this does an excellent job at exemplifying the sort of selflessness of Kitty Pryde, and also just the desperation of this future, and also sort of at our core, the human necessity for longevity as a species, whether that be mutants or humans, There's so much heart and connective and fun writing in here too. Something you might not know if this is the first X-Men comic you've picked up and read is that this is early on in the appearances of Kitty Pryde, and at this point she's still pretty uncomfortable or frightened around Nightcrawler based on his demon appearance, despite, him being a huge big softie. But what I loved, and was a really small but touching moment, is when the Kitty from the future first wakes up in the past, she's immediately so thrilled to see Nightcrawler, a friend who's been dead in her universe, and she gives him a big embrace, and it's just an endearing moment that also serves as a reminder of the terrible losses that are suffered in such cataclysmic events. So, after all the initial what is going on from the X-Men and all the shock and everything, Kitty explains to them exactly what happened, and she explains to them that the day that they are existing in right now is extremely pivotal to mutant and really human history as a whole. And that is because, on this day, in Kitty's timeline, the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants murdered the presidential candidate Robert Kelly, along with Charles Xavier and Moira McTaggart. And the Moira thing is actually interesting, considering recent retcons with the character and her secret mutant ability. I wonder if that's been addressed at all. If you know, please leave a comment. I'd be curious to read anything about that. But going back to how this terrible future happened, Kitty also explains that really it was Robert Kelly's death that set forth a motion of events where mutant hate increased and a very strong, extremist, anti-mutant president was elected, and he ended up reactivating the Sentinels, and they actually even brought in the programming for it, and it basically just caused this entire nuclear holocaust because the Sentinels decided that the best way to proactively take care of the mutant problem would be to take over the country at large. And what we're seeing here is a kind of hate boomerang, which sounds rhetorically silly, but what I mean is that the country chose to lean into bigotry and legislative policies that targeted a disenfranchised group, and because they threw so much vitriol and hate at it, it actually swung back and came right back at them, and they suffer the consequences because of it. And as Kitty is trying to change the future, the story actually does take us back to that future to see what's going on as Kitty's mind is in the past, and what we see essentially is the entire crew being systematically taken out one by one by the Sentinels. This was advertised as an issue where everybody dies, and they're able to do that because of this alternate timeline, and they were able to actually kill off a lot of these X-Men characters here. Now, of course, it's a comic book. deaths don't usually mean anything, and it certainly didn't mean anything here, because as we all know, we're not going to stay in this future timeline. And when I say these deaths don't mean anything, I of course mean in larger continuity. Obviously, within the story, these deaths are pretty impactful, and it is sad to see, because we're seeing the X-Men at the end of the road. These are the ones who fought so hard, and it's almost like hope is dying a little bit, but there is that sliver because Kitty is still at work. But moving on to what is the center stage of this story, we go to Washington DC and to the United States Senate. And I want to share how Claremont describes the US Senate because I think it's pretty interesting considering the context that I gave early in the video about Claremont's upbringing in the United States. So he says, "The United States Senate has been described as the greatest deliberative body on earth. It has seen noble times and shameful ones. It has epitomized the highest ideals of humanity and the worst realities." And I think there's definitely a connection there between that viewpoint and some of the notable historical legislative policies that were passed or attempted to pass during Claremont's upbringing. So just sharing something I thought was interesting here. It's definitely fun for me to try and make a connection to see how a writer's viewpoints were sort of cultivated. But anyway, on to the issue at hand that the Senate is called to debate today, and the reason that Charles and Moira are there is that Senator Kelly is debating with them just about mutant rights and mankind's role in a world where such powerful beings exist. Now, I wouldn't mind a House of Cards style X-Men issue where we just see the fruits of this debate, but action has a way of finding itself into X-Men comics as the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, led by Mystique, breaks into the Senate and is there to assassinate Robert Kelly. But the X-Men have shown up and they are fighting for Robert Kelly. They're fighting to keep him alive. They're fighting to stop this terrible future from happening, which is a unique position that the X-Men do find themselves in a lot of the time, and that is defending somebody who is ideologically opposed to you. And this is a dangerous ideological enemy, considering what we know about the future Kitty's timeline, and just considering the fact that the legislation this man espouses for is predicated on hatred and benign fear underneath that. It's pretty interesting from Robert Kelly's perspective too, and hopefully this will be an eye-opening experience for him when the X-Men come to defend him, because this is a category of people that he has just been relentlessly campaigning against, and they are the only ones that can really stop him from being taken out. And the stakes are high on both sides. For Mystique and the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, at this point, they believe their only way forward and the best way to combat this sort of mutant hatred that has been spewing and boiling in the country and the world is through political violence. So while their actions are kind of objectively wrong here, and they're just essentially doing a terrorism, which is really, really bad, they equally, in a way, believe that they're fighting to secure their future. The irony being that if they got their way, it would definitely ruin everyone's future. Now, the tail end of this story and the second issue is mostly a lot of fighting, which is really fun, really exciting. There's some character moments that don't really pan out immediately, but are kind of a long play, like Nightcrawler realizing that Mystique looks kind of similar to him. Weird. But this all ends with Destiny cornering Robert Kelly and holding him hostage with a crossbow that she's about to shoot him with, and all the other X-Men are preoccupied, so the only character that's there and available to save this man is our future Kitty Pryde. And this is the moment where she would have to make the decision, is she going to go through with this? Is she going to save Senator Robert Kelly? And is she going to eviscerate her timeline by doing so and everything she knew and everyone she loved there? Unbeknownst to her, many of the people that she loved have already died while she was in the past. But it's not even really a moment of decision for her at this point. Her mind has been made up. She is strong, she is going through with this plan. This was what they meant to do, and they're going to do it. Not just for her, but for everybody. So she phases through Destiny and the crossbolt, and she saves Robert Kelly. And at that point, Kitty from the present regains her consciousness. She's no longer the mind of Kitty from the future, and in fact, this is us circling back to that second question, is there a way to stop that future? Well, we don't actually get a solid answer. It's left a little ambiguous. We never hear from that future Kitty Pryde again, and we don't get any more scenes that are set in that future timeline. So it seems to be implied that yes, they were able to stop that from happening, but with most things, only time can truly tell. As for Senator Kelly, does he see the error of his ways? Does he change? Well, Storm certainly reminds him that like all people and mutants, there are good ones and there are bad ones. There's a wide spectrum of personalities and ideologies, but bigotry can be deep-rooted, and it's hard for some people to take a step back and examine their biases. And we're unfortunately left with a Senator Kelly who seems to really only leave with the message that if mutants hadn't existed, there wouldn't have been an assassination attempt on his life. So I think there's a balance of some bleakness and some hope to this ending, which often mimics how these things go in real life. Progress doesn't always move at a steady pace, and sometimes it can be hard to see the good that's being done with all the negativity clouding up the area. But overall, Days of Future Past may be based on timeless tropes and story types, but Claremont in only 2 issues makes the trope refreshingly his own. To me, it's a wonderful story, a very political story, and a great exemplification of the morality of the X-Men in the face of a world that doesn't understand them, doesn't try to understand them, and chooses to vilify them constantly. Thank you guys so much for checking out this video today. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a comment, let me know your thoughts on the story, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Have a great rest of your day.